Dyslexia often comes as a package deal, meaning that you don't just have dyslexia, but you have another learning difference aside from your dyslexia. This is true for over 62% of dyslexics. Hey, my name is Ari, I'm a dyslexic, and I have a master's degree in education studies. And this video is my part 2 on combinations of learning differences. In the past, I talked about the combinations between dyslexia and ADHD, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, as well as anxiety disorders. And as of now, that has been the most liked video I've ever made. In this video, I would like to go over the following combinations: dyslexia and dyspraxia, dyslexia and the inattentive type of ADHD, dyslexia and ASD, as well as dyslexia and ODD. Before we start, I think you should know that having a combination of different learning differences is the norm rather than the exception. This is due to shared risk factors, underlying issues that these different learning differences have in common. And I think you should know about your combination so that you understand yourself better and so that other people are able to help you more effectively. So let's start with the combination between dyslexia and dyspraxia. People with dyspraxia generally have trouble with coordinated motor skills. Dyspraxia is also known as developmental coordination disorder. And in order to qualify for dyspraxia, it has to interfere with daily living. It is estimated that 6 to 10% of the population has dyspraxia. And if you already have dyslexia, your chances of having dyspraxia at the same time are around 52 to 85%. Generally speaking, both people with dyspraxia and people with dyslexia have trouble with their working memory. However, if we go a little bit into detail, we notice that dyslexics typically have trouble with their verbal working memory, and people with dyspraxia struggle more with their visual spatial subpart of their working memory. So if you think you might have dyspraxia in addition to your dyslexia, then ask yourself the following questions. And I'm going to read these out to you. Is your handwriting hard to read? Do you have poor hand-eye coordination? Is it hard for you to control movements like throwing, catching, or jumping? And do you tend to drop or bump into things? If you now say, well, that sounds like me, then there's a chance that you have dyspraxia in addition to your dyslexia. The inattentive subtype of ADHD often goes undiagnosed because typically people tend to connect hyperactivity to ADHD, and that makes a lot of sense. But this subtype of ADHD does not require the hyperactive part of it. It is what formerly was known as ADD, and these children typically struggle or mainly struggle with their attention span. Around 9% of the entire population has ADHD. Now, if you were to ask me, well, how many of those people have this inattentive subtype of ADHD, then I couldn't really tell you, because if we have a look at these 5 different studies right next to me, then you'll see, well, they all come up with different numbers. What I can tell you, however, is that if you already have dyslexia, your chance of having ADHD at the same time is around 40%. We do not fully understand why dyslexia and ADHD often comes as a package deal, but we do know that genetic factors play a role, and we also know that children with reading difficulties often also have trouble with attention. Now, if you think you might have this inattentive subtype of ADHD, then ask yourself the following questions. Is it hard for you to pay attention? Are you easily distracted? Is it hard for you to organize tasks and activities? And lastly, do you often avoid or dislike doing things that require sustained mental effort? So also this time, if you can identify with these questions, then take a deeper look into this subtype of ADHD. Next up is the combination between dyslexia and ASD, which stands for Autism Spectrum Disorder. People with autism generally struggle with social interaction, but also nonverbal communication is hard, and autism is also characterized by restricted and repetitive behavior. Now, that can look like a child that lines up his or her pencils repetitively according to color and length, or the child might drum his or her fingers against a table repetitively. Around 1% of the population has autism, And researchers estimate that if you already have dyslexia, that your chance of having autism at the same time is between 6 and 30%. Both people with dyslexia and people with autism have trouble with reading comprehension, language, and visual auditory processing. However, researchers question whether there is a true connection between the two, because just because we see similar symptoms, that does not mean that the cause of those symptoms is also the same. For example, dyslexics struggle with phonemic awareness, and that is not something that affects people with autism. If you think you might have ASD in addition to your dyslexia, then ask yourself the following questions. Are you sensitive to loud noises, bright lights, or other senses? Do you find it hard to develop, maintain, and understand relationships? Is your routine very important to you? And do you have trouble understanding nonverbal communication? So if this sounds familiar to you, I would look into it a little further. And girls have been missed a lot because they exhibit more social behavior and they do something called masking, where they copy the social behavior, let's say, of a very good friend, and that's why they are often missed. Okay, and now to dyslexia and ODD. Even the best behaved individuals can sometimes be challenging and difficult. But if you're looking at persistent patterns of anger, irritability, defiance, and vindictive behavior, then you might be looking at ODD, which stands for Oppositional Defiant Disorder. And these behavior patterns are generally directed towards figures of authority. So for example, parents or also teachers. And when we're looking at frequency of the behavior, then we're looking at a time period of at least 6 months. And if the child is above the age of 5, it has to occur at least once a week. Between 2 and 16% of the population has ODD. Now, if you already have dyslexia, then your chance of having ODD at the same time is around 17%. So why does dyslexia and ODD often co-occur? Well, we do know that both groups have abnormal language processing and also difficulties in working memory. But we also need to consider the dyslexic experience because it can be difficult and hard at times. So that experience can be seen as a risk factor for developing ODD, even though literature has not clearly established a causal relationship between the two. So if you suspect ODD in addition to dyslexia in yourself or in somebody you know, then here are some questions for you. Do you often lose your temper and are you easily annoyed? Do you often argue with authority figures? Are you often unwilling to do what you are told? And lastly, can you think of 2 times in the last 6 months that you wanted revenge or felt spiteful? So also here I would have a look if these questions apply to you or to somebody that you know. And I think it's good to remember that we can help people way better if we understand them as a whole. And if you want to do me a favor, then give this video a like and see you in the next one. And just as a reminder, there's a part 1 to this video that you can find here.